What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some beloved games that frankly just didn't sell very well. Which I thought was an interesting topic after recently reviewing a game that, after looking into it, had shockingly low sales for itself, and combined with the sort of ever-present discussion about a game's sales or player count being determinations of success, I thought it might be an interesting thing to cover. But here at the beginning, probably worth a mention then, following on from that information, that as hopefully this video would show you, sales are really only one part of the equation, because it really depends on what you are measuring success by. And I think, if we're being honest, it's really a combination of these things. Like, obviously, a game is going to need to sell decently well to be successful by default. It's great if everybody loved a game, but if it didn't move enough copies to not have to fire the entire studio, that's not exactly a great outcome. And while I am well aware that my own reputation on the internet tends to lean probably being too positive, one thing that might surprise people is that when it comes to finances, I am a realist. Many people know that I was homeless as a teenager, that I used to work a job in sales after that, and for many other reasons, I'm probably a little more hyper-aware of the finances of something than most people. So to keep it very short here, yes, things need to make money, frankly. And yet, at the same time, I think if you reduce especially a medium like video games purely to their financial outcomes, then that is reductive, frankly, of their potential either artistic value or what that experience can mean to somebody who plays it on an emotional level, which is obviously very different from finances. And while I am certainly not expecting any video I make to put to bed conversations that have been taking place for decades, I did just want to take a moment to sort of highlight that sort of interactivity between those two things. Games can be awesome and not make any money or not move a lot of units, and games can sell very well and also be not very good. And to, of course, complicate that further, everything I just said is very subjective by its nature. People's opinions on what is and is not good is going to vary dramatically, which is why these conversations are, of course, ceaseless. And yet, in the case of the games I'm about to go over, much of the conversation around them is extremely positive, which in some cases, by word of mouth, saw a bit of a redemption arc for a couple of them, and for others these games just outright flopped, leading to layoffs, closures, etc. So with no further ado, let's actually dive in and talk about it. So probably the easiest game in the world to point to when it comes to this particular subject is Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. In fact, with its fully realized version via things like the unofficial patch, many people consider Bloodlines a masterpiece, and yet it is very well known that it did not do well financially on its launch, which was a situation that was contributed to by multiple factors. The fact that they released on the same day as Half-Life 2, as an example, certainly didn't help. Nor did a lot of the unfortunate bugs the game shipped with, and yet even reviews all the way back then during that period were pretty favorable to Bloodlines if you actually go and read them, with a lot of the sort of general sentiment being that it was a hard game to play because of the bugs, but what you could play was pretty good. Follow on from that then with the unofficial patch that has since cleared up basically every issue that game's ever had, while also modernizing it for machines these days, as its original release was all the way back in 2004, but now people can see this game for what it was intended to be, I imagine, which is a very replayable, fun experience that really focuses in on an experience that is not exactly replicated in basically any other fashion. There are precious few good vampire games, frankly. Even all these years later, there really just isn't anything quite like Bloodlines 1, which is why then, at least in part, why people are so skeptical about the potential sequel. Not least of which because of the development problems over there as well, mind you. But all the love that Bloodlines received after the fact led to a sort of interesting situation where the game did not do well on release. That is just a fact. However, since then, especially with, say, its Steam release, it's seen a bit of a resurgence, with it actually having sold quite a bit over there. So Bloodlines ultimately found its place in the universe, despite its relatively frosty reception at the time. And yet, a few years prior to that experience, another game that is considered a foundational title these days actually sold much worse. So this is actually the game that inspired this video, which was System Shock 2, which recently got a remaster release that I played through, which was my first time playing it, and in doing some research for that title, I learned that as much good things as I've heard about this game, it flopped hard, actually. So this game originally released in 1999, and in almost the entire first year of its release, it sold about 60,000 copies, a little less technically. Which is interesting because just through playing that remaster, it becomes quickly apparent that System Shock 2 was a game that was very ahead of its time. And maybe that's why it didn't sell well, but reality is it did not sell well. Which I thought was especially interesting because that was just a fact that seems to have flew under the radar, for me at least, because every time I had heard anybody talk about System Shock 2 specifically, it was with the highest of praise, and how it factually went on to inspire and influence so many immersive sims afterwards. And having now played it for myself, I can see why. It genuinely is a fantastic game. And while I think some of the more horror-esque elements have not exactly aged well due to things like the graphics, it's just not the kind of thing I could see myself getting particularly upset by these days. That was also a big selling point of it back then. So it was this really generationally important title to a lot of people, which is probably echoed by the fact that its release reviews were just critical acclaim across the board, pretty much the highest marks. And then you see the sales numbers and they are just bafflingly low back then. In fact, I would almost be willing to bet that the remaster likely outsold the original in its first day, in what can only be described as a real shock to the system. Moving on a little bit though, and keeping with the immersive sim genre, we then have, of course, Prey 2017, which is an interesting title because I would not really consider this one to have flopped, but rather disappointed is probably a better word. Now, in many ways, Prey is actually a sort of spiritual successor to games like System Shock, just to, again, kind of echo some of the influence that game had on people. And much of that really comes down to the variety of ways in which you can find your way through the space station you find yourself on in Prey. And while I honestly don't love everything about this game, I think stuff around the enemies you're fighting, the sort of alien species is, it's hit or miss for me. I could take it or leave it. Everything else about the game is just fantastic, from the gameplay, the atmosphere, making you actually feel like you are on this desolate space station with less than great odds of living. And then, of course, the big twist at the end. It's an awesome game, and in fact, that's a sentiment that is echoed by most people who play it. It really is quite the experience. But when it comes to talking about why this game didn't sell, a lot of it honestly probably does have to do with marketing in this case. There really just wasn't a lot of it. I believe they withheld review copies until launch day at that. And I wasn't even reviewing games back then. It was a couple more years before I started doing this in full. So I don't claim to be an expert on the situation, mind you. But it's my understanding that Prey opened to 60-ish% less sales than, say, Dishonored 2, made by the same people. So it's interesting then to see a lot of the conversation around Prey these days really kind of talk about how it was this underrated gem, especially after the studio's closure not all that long ago. Which kind of puts us in an interesting situation where a game like Prey, it's probably not fair to say that something like that really flopped so much that it just had a weak launch that it never really recovered from. And while word of mouth and everything has been good for it these days, it certainly didn't make any financial waves, which is certainly disappointing, frankly, given how good the game itself is. But that does bring us to yet another interesting title, which is actually Jade Empire. One of the earlier games out of BioWare that just kind of never saw any support or further development of the franchise afterwards. It's an odd game. In many ways, I would say you can kind of feel the direction BioWare was headed as a studio in Jade Empire, at least in its early days, as they were already trimming back a lot of the bigger role-playing options from some of their previous work. And while I think Jade Empire is still a really fun game that does a lot of just unique stuff you certainly don't see a lot of these days, it's also got some issues, not least of which the fact that the Steam version of it, if you buy it, it just straight up won't run unless you modify some files. That still hasn't been enough to keep people away from enjoying the unique experience that Jade Empire is. In fact, it has one of those twists at the end that I think most people regard very, very highly, even the combat system of combining various martial arts styles being really fun. And yet, in spite of that, we have yet another game with middling sales. Now, what's interesting about this one one is that a lot of that is actually attributed to when the game released. It was sort of at the end of the console generation, and it didn't really release on like Xbox 360 as an example, meaning that there were certainly other extenuating market factors that certainly had at least a little bit to do with the game's pretty underwhelming sales figures, and that at the very least certainly contributed then, of course, to BioWare's thinking about whether or not to continue the series, which they did toy around with those ideas for a little while, but ultimately it, of course, never went anywhere, leaving Jade Empire this sort of one-off odd duck of a game that many people who actually played it were, in fact, hoping for more of. Now, if I'm being perfectly honest, Jade Empire is a game that I do think people tend to overhype a little bit. If you hear people talk about it online these days, they tend to have very glowing praise for the title, and while I do agree it's good, I do think people also get a little carried away with this one. But either way, it was a much-loved game that we are unfortunately never going to see more of, it would seem. Though that does bring us to our final title, one that is very near and dear to me, and this is actually Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire, my personal favorite title out of Obsidian Entertainment, a game I hold a record for no less. So I am certainly one of those people who has this title in the beloved category. And yet, Deadfire sales were underwhelming. In fact, it's my understanding that it took a couple years for the game to actually turn a profit, until I believe right around the time Avowed was initially announced, when some of the interest for the World Series of Avowed got people to buy Deadfire, which takes place in the same universe, and that helped drive some of it from, again, what I know. It eventually did turn a profit, mind you, but it did not do nearly as well as its predecessor, Pillars of Eternity, which is a real shame given that I, at least personally, think Deadfire is a vast improvement over almost every system of its original title. Which is certainly saying something, because Pillars of Eternity is one of those CRPGs that rode a Kickstarter wave early on that kind of reignited CRPGs in the modern day, and in many ways we can actually thank that little wave for Baldur's Gate 3 in some ways, because Divinity Original Sin also rode that wave, and that is what led Larian Studios on that path to eventually put out that game. And Pillars of Eternity's massive success with its initial Kickstarter campaign was both a boon and a detriment. It was a detriment in the sense that they made a lot of obligations to backers that they ultimately had to fulfill that, if I'm being real honest, probably make the game a little worse. Which is probably what informed their decision then to take Deadfire also on crowdfunding, but through a different platform called Fig, and they also had a publisher for it as well, which was Versus Evil. And those two things combined probably at least contributed to this not being like a complete disaster. But that's really such a shame, because Deadfire is an incredible experience. It is, at least for me, absolutely in my top 10 CRPGs, period. And I've played and reviewed tons of them. In fact, in my old ranking video, I believe I have it at number 4. I do certainly have some critiques. They almost certainly overcorrected on the story length from the first one, with the main story of 2 being very short in comparison, with most of the content being like side content instead, which leads the main narrative a little thin at best. But it's always been a world that's really captured me. I've loved the lore of it more than anything else. But a lot of love for both the gameplay and the setting itself is what inspired me to go after the Ultimate Challenge, which is a big community challenge they put out with, I believe, the game's final update right around then, which was to beat the game in the hardest possible settings, send in a save and recording to them so they could officially verify it, which I did just earlier this year, actually, so I've still been playing it since then. So I was, of course, still playing it since its release and everything. And that challenge is so difficult that all these years later, I was the 15th person to finish it out of a possible 50. And the challenge started in 2019, which I mention just to point out that it's a game with a fantastic depth to its systems that can be as easy or as difficult as you want to make it, because there are a whole bunch of options to make it easier on yourself as well. And I think it's a real shame then that this game didn't see as much love as I would have liked, especially since I am one of those people who would fall all over myself to get a Pillars of Eternity 3. I think it is probably one of my biggest gaming wishes, really, is to see that sequel be made, and while I think it's more possible now than it was in the past, especially right after all these sales issues propped up, the genre has been doing better and better these days, and I think, under the right circumstances, it would be a possible sales pitch. And I think given that Obsidian is under Microsoft now, simply not having to owe things to, like, backers and whatnot would give them the freedom to actually make Pillars 3 what they wanted it to be, as opposed to being beholden to all of these other obligations. Now, on the flip side of that, I do think if we ever get Pillars 3, it will likely be a little more expensive than I would like, given how things have been going these days, but I would certainly be one of the most excited people for it one way or another. So I give you just all of that information there about this game to basically say that it's very obvious I enjoy and really love Deadfire for what it is, so it would be very silly of me to then be upset or care much about how well it did financially, outside of just, whether or not I get a sequel. The idea that somebody else's opinion about how well Deadfire did or what its player count is would somehow have any effect at all about my feelings about this game and how much effort I have put into it and how much I've enjoyed it is laughable at best. And yet, in spite of that, it doesn't change the financial realities of that situation, being that because of Deadfire's lagging sales and the fact that it just did not do well financially initially, which has then of course caused some trepidation in getting a potential third one green-lighted, if that passion is even there on the team as a result of that, is, I think, again, just another really great example of how there is more than one factor to all of this, and then there is also how each individual person feels about all of those factors, which naturally then makes for an incredibly messy situation anytime stuff like this comes up, which is a lot to keep track of when you're greenlighting things and playing around with a lot of money to go into developing something that you want to see a return on your investment for. And at the end of the day, I'm just one guy on the internet. I can't do anything about any of that. But what I can do is make unnecessary YouTube videos expressing opinions nobody asked for about games that mean the world to me, which has hopefully been at least somewhat entertaining to listen to, which is obviously where we're going to leave off. Certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe. Let me know how you feel about all this down in the comments section below. I'd love to hear about some games that you love that perhaps didn't get the love you hoped they would financially. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.